It's a pretty unremarkable building. You'd be forgiven for driving past, as many do, giving it no more notice than you would perhaps to an old farm shed. Having served a purpose, its own builders even abandoned it more than a century ago, leaving it to decay and fate. But it was a community that built this church. It would be a community that would save it. Hello, my name is Kevin Frankish, and it's been my honor as a journalist to have documented some of the efforts and the results of this community effort to save the Oro African Church. I'm joined by Janie Cooper Wilson, a descendant of those who settled here in the early 19th century, many fleeing slavery in the United States. Today, she works tirelessly keeping their memory alive. And Sema Othman, who helped shepherd a massive crowdfunding effort to save this church. But first, let's find out more about this little log building that was witness to precious freedom. Janie, tell me about your relationship with the church and with this area of Ontario.
Well, my three times great grandfather was one of the trustees of the Oro African Church. My two times great grandparents were married in the church in 1864. And I'm hoping, actually, this past August 1st weekend, my beautiful daughter and her intended were planning on being married in the church, which made me just, feel like jumping over the moon. My arthritis didn't stop me. But, we had to cancel because of COVID. It's a long history there. And I am descended on my mother's side to the Oro settlement.
And you are every bit as important, if not more important, than the history books, because a lot of our history from that time, from that church, was never written down, but passed on from your great relatives right on down to you and to your kids.
Well, there's a lot of us out here, and, Rob Green is another. Now, the way he relates the stories is through his music and his songwriting. And each of us, I just happen to be out front, not necessarily by choice. It just, this is my calling. And, working on the church project was just the highlight of my life. I believe, and most African descendants believe, that if you honor the ancestors, they in turn will intercede for you and bless you. And believe me, anything that I did toward the restoration of that church has come back tenfold. I am just so truly, truly blessed. Even up to last summer, I'm still finding descendants that had no idea, and to see their faces. I took a lady and her granddaughter there to the grounds last summer, and the most amazing thing happened because in First Nations tradition, the butterfly means transition. And this lady had no idea. She was born, as the saying went, on the other side of the blanket. So she had no clue, and her ancestry came out, just by accident. And her daughter contacted me, and I knew exactly where she fit in. She's a bush for Othman's, Salma's benefit there. She's descended from the Bush family. And while we were sitting under the big tree, the butterflies just started swarming all around me. And one lit in the palm of my hand. And I handed it to her. And it flew from my hand to hers. And she just went to pieces. But I see this type of thing all the time. And for the establishment, it's hard to believe. But this is our ancestry.
Take me back to you as a little girl. And do you recall a particular time, a particular story that stands out in your mind? Paint the picture for us.
Oh my. Well, since we're talking about the church, as Sama can tell you, the history that's come down through, the history of Simcoe County is that the settlement was a humanitarian effort. Well, I guess from the white community's perspective, it was, because we were our people were the poor Black people, but it was not from our perspective. After our people were there for a while, it became, we were convenient. What happened when that settlement began? The Blacks that fought in the War of 1812 were all centered around the Niagara District. Well, when the war was over, everybody was fighting for payment for war losses, damage to their crops, damage to their homes, damage to their farms. And the government promised land grants. Well, up to 20 years after, the Black men that fought and died and shed blood, they had to fight again to get what was due to them from the British Crown and the Canadian government. So, the government at the time was being hit from all sides. And so they had to keep everybody happy. They couldn't deny that the Black men fought. It's like the First Nation brothers that fought with the Blacks and turned the tide at Queenston Heights. They're still fighting over the treaties because we were second-class and third-class citizens.
Indeed, the Black soldiers received some land grants, but they were usually half of what a white soldier would get, and usually in an area that wasn't great for farming.
Well, exactly. And the white soldiers that were up in this area, up in the Midland area, they couldn't get their wives. They didn't want to go out in the wilderness. So there were the Black men saying, listen, we want land. We fought for it. We want what is just due to us. Many applied, but they still had to provide for their families. They still had to get their crops in. So a lot settled elsewhere. Those that did come here, it was a strategic position, halfway between the garrison up in Midland and the capital of York.
We're learning more and more as well, and we're sort of learning a more true account of history, because at the time, slavery was still a thing in Canada. It wasn't completely
Oh, yeah.
abolished. It wasn't as bad as the US, but it was still there. There were still people fighting to keep slavery alive. John Graves Simcoe had tried his best just to get it completely down and out abolished. So
That wasn't going to happen.
and just because they had made it to Canada didn't mean all their troubles were over, did it?
Well, you would be amazed at the number of people, Kevin, today that do not know the difference between the British emancipation and the American emancipation. So, many times I'd be standing outside that church, and in the lectures that I do over the years, they say, well, why were they afraid? Why were they afraid of slave catchers and all that? Because for that 30 years interim, the slave catchers, whether it was legal or not, could still come over that border and take our people back, whether they were born free or not.
And in
If
fact,
they were born of a former slave woman, the slave master could take them back. He considered them property.
and that happened several times. Yeah.
Exactly. So, in all the Black communities, vigilance committees were formed. If you saw, a strange man in the area sniffing around, that word passed like wildfire.
And that gave this church significance. There was a need for this church, not just for the spiritual need of this community, but beyond that.
Absolutely. And the misconception about night watch, in the history books, they talk about people in their sleighs riding up in front of the church, listening to the Black people singing and clapping, and how, the ministers were, it was Mr. 80 that would just get the spirit and would be, as according to the history book, literally be climbing the walls, because he was so full of the spirit.
So, Sam, tell me about the need and the desire to save this church.
Thank you, Kevin. So throughout the years, community members worked really hard to preserve and keep the church functional. In fact, in 2003, the church was designated as a National Historical Site by Parks Canada. Unfortunately, by 2014, the church was on the verge of collapsing.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the township of Oro-Medonte had to close the church to the public. So with a very tight budget and no alternate funding, the township did something very unconventional. And what we decided to do at the time was launch a GoFundMe campaign, which is a crowdfunding campaign to raise money that was needed to save the church. And in 2015, the GoFundMe campaign was launched with $140,000 as its goal. As part of the campaign, it was really important for the township to demonstrate the importance of the church and why we had to save it. To Janie's point, there's so much history, there's so many stories that needed to be shared. And really, the church is a symbol of Canada's strength and diversity, and it represents what people did to protect our religious rights and freedoms that we're so fortunate to have today. Janie is right that some people take this for granted. And I immigrated here from Egypt when I was 2 years old, so over 45 years ago. And I can tell you that I feel so blessed to be a Canadian, and I feel that we are so fortunate to have these religious rights and cultural freedoms that many other countries are not able to celebrate even today. So when I became involved with the church, I became very passionate about really sharing its story for its cultural significance, and also to preserve the historical significance, because there are many other beautiful stories that need to be shared about the church.
So let's look at a timeline of this, and this was news. This CBC came and did a national story on the fundraising efforts.
By the time we launched the crowdfunding campaign, a few months had passed and it received national and international attention. We raised $92,000 from donations from around the world. By May 2015, the township received provincial funding through the Trillium Fund in the amount of $121,000, with $27,000 going to the Vaughan African Canadian Association to publish a children's book that they can use as part of their curriculum. By 2015, we received federal funding in the amount of $77,000 from Parks Canada, with many other donations in kind. So the story of the church really impacted people, and people wanted to help in any way possible.
So your goal for the crowdfunding campaign was $140,000. What ended up being raised altogether?
We raised over $200,000.
Wow.
So we ended up closing the crowdfunding campaign early, and any of the extra money that was raised was put into a reserve fund that would help with the future maintenance and management of the church. In fact, after we closed the crowdfunding campaign, many other donations continued to come in because people really wanted to feel like they were a part of the church and make a contribution to help save it. In fact, we received a donation that meant a lot to me, because it really validated the importance of the church. And it came from a student, a history student, who only had $5 in his bank account. And he said, "This is the last bit of money I have, but I'm a history student. I think it's really important that we share these stories and keep history alive," and donated his last $5 to the church. And we also got donations from atheists. So this church really resonated with people, regardless of their cultural backgrounds, their religious backgrounds. And again, it stands as a true testament of what this has been all about.
So it definitely made an impact.
Yes. So by August 2016, we held a grand reopening. Hundreds of people from around the world attended. It brought descendants together. It brought people who didn't even know they were related or connected together. And it was so heartfelt. It was warming. We had the Lieutenant Governor General there speaking, and it was just remarkable.
Tell me about the recognition and the awards it's received.
The township received Provincial and Historical Association awards for the preservation of the church and community leadership. It was the first project to ever receive 2 awards in the same year by the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario.
It's interesting, too. We had Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, in the 1790s and into 1800, who was working to abolish slavery outright, and he met up with resistance, but he worked so hard. And now we have today's Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Dowdeswell, who also is taking an active interest in the community.
I will leave you with the quote by the Lieutenant Governor about the church. "The church is at the heart of many stories fundamental to Ontarians and Canadians. It is a story of community and neighbors coming together to preserve the church. And it's a story of freedom and equality."
Janie, final words.
Learn, see, understand. If people see the church, go to the church to visit the church, and actually take the time to absorb the essence of those walls and the grounds that they're walking on, because they are walking over the ancestors. Allow their essence to come into their being, and see others not for the color of their skin, but as Dr. King said, for the content of their character. That church and everything that it opens up for humanity brings so much healing, but the person has to be ready to accept that.
Thank you both, Janie and Sama, for sharing. Some final words. This time we got lucky. This important part of the history of Oro-Medonte, Barrie, and Canada as a whole nearly disappeared from existence. We are all now stewards of this church, no matter what race. And I don't mean stewards of the wood and the nails, but of what it was built for, what it still stands for, and who built it. A community that knows the true meaning of precious freedom. Thank you.